I've done something right in Lent when I was talking about the prodigal father to get invited back. So I'm very grateful to Patrick and to Patricia and the committee for inviting me back. So, of course, when they invited me back, afterwards is when they told me the topic, which is doubt and belonging, which is a little daunting to talk about, but hopefully I will have some coherent things to say, and that will invite us into some conversation. So I'd like to start with a blog post by a woman by the name of Rachel Held Evans. Rachel was a wonderful writer, author, blogger who died far too young, and she died in 2019. And this blog post is from July of 2014. I don't always tell you. I don't always tell you about the mornings I wake up and feel the absence of God as though it were a presence, thick and certain, remembered all over again the way you remember in the morning that someone you love has died. Or about the days when the idea that a single religion can stop the CNN crawler from reporting one more missile strike, one more downed plane, one more bombed hospital, strikes me as freshly stupid and dangerously naive. They keep using words like unthinkable and unimaginable to describe the violence. But let's be honest, there's nothing unthinkable or unimaginable about all this. It's as routine to us as eating, as breathing, as hating. We dream this stuff up all the time. I don't always tell you about how sometimes I'm not sure I want to bring kids into a world like this one, a world so full of suffering. Because that sort of thing doesn't exactly sell off the shelves at Christian bookstores, does it? What do you do when the religion that is supposed to give you comfort and direction is the cause of your pain and confusion? What do you do when religious people respond to your questions by calling you names, by mocking you, by casting you out? I don't always tell you about the depth of my doubt. I don't always tell you about how the cynicism settles in like a diaphanous fog, or how sometimes just the thought of reading one more Christian book I only half believe exhausts and bores me. There is no need for a diagnosis. This isn't the sort of clinical depression which so many good people struggle with. Privileged as I am, I can cut off the flow of information, shut the laptop, turn off the news, and head outside. My mood lifts, I can gaze into the dizzying blue of a clear sky and believe in God again. Because at least for me, that sky isn't filled with missiles or bombs. I have the luxury of forgetting. Sometimes it frightens me how effortlessly I can move from belief to unbelief, as one would move from room to room. Kathleen Norris called it acedia, the new day demon, a religious and relational apathy that makes it seem as if the sun barely moves, if at all. That sounds about right to me, stuck in the unforgiving glare of midday when every truth has a sharp edge. I don't always tell you, because when a reader says, "I love it when you write something vulnerable," I wonder if she really means it, if she really wants to know the demon whose voice she thinks she's quieted in her own heart is screaming like hell in mine. And that the scariest thing about being vulnerable, about exposing myself to a world without religion or a platform or a brand for protection, is that I might lose them for good, perhaps learn that I can breathe without them. And that's not exactly the sort of born-again spirits that publishers pay for. Well, that about says it all. This year, as many of you probably know or should know, we're celebrating the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, which brought about the Nicene Creed, a doctrinal statement which we just said at liturgy and is common to all Christian traditions around the world. It was a statement crafted to combat the heresies of the day about who Jesus was. Was he of God? Was he of man? Was he kind of a demagogue? What's the relationship of the Trinity? And so it was about correct belief. And in fact, when we read the Nicene Creed, as we did today, we see it tells us very little about the life and the story of Jesus. It's a lot of statements about who he was, who God is, what the Trinity says in relationship to each other. And despite its attempt to bring about the Christian church, it actually was the cause of one of the first breaks, with a statement in there called the homoousios, of whether this was the break between the Eastern and Western churches, whether Jesus proceeds from the Father, as the Easterns believed, or he proceeds from the Father and the Son, as we in the West believe. So it's pretty hard to kind of get to that point of saying, what is belief and where does doubt fit? Here's another quote from Rachel Held Evans. We don't want to choose between science and religion or between our intellectual integrity and our faith. Instead, we long for our churches to be safe places to doubt, to ask questions, to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. We want to talk about the tough stuff, biblical interpretation, religious pluralism, sexuality, racial reconciliation, and social justice, but without predetermined conclusions or simplistic answers. We want to bring our whole selves through the church doors, without leaving our hearts and our minds behind, without wearing a mask. So I believe, as did Rachel, as did Brian McLaren, who I'll talk about in a bit, that our churches, our faith communities, should be places where we can bring our whole selves. They can be places where we can come with our doubts. Now, the reality is that's often not the case, right? Often we feel, oh, I can't express my doubt here because I'm not going to be welcome anymore. Sometimes we feel, and if we're honest, each of us have felt this way at some point, like C.S. Lewis. Often when I pray, I wonder if I am not posting letters to a non-existent address. Doubt is not the absence of faith. Actually, certainty is. But doubt is a necessary part of our faith journey. Paul Tillich, the great theologian of the last century, said, doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It's an element of faith. And as a theologian, he was saying, sometimes I think it's my mission to bring faith to the faithless and doubt to the faithful. So I'd like to spend a good portion of my time this morning talking about Brian McLaren's work. I think it's a very important work, and hopefully some of you have read it. It's called Faith After Doubt. When I got this assignment and this topic, I picked up a whole bunch of books about, can you see it? There you go. Lots of books. There's lots of books out there about doubt. But Brian McLaren, who's on the faculty at the Center for Action and Contemplation, and has really progressed in his own story, his own faith life. He grew up as an evangelical Christian, and he developed into this person who really came to understand what it meant to question one's faith life, to question one's belief, to come to an understanding of the God who is not simply that childish God that we often keep our beliefs in, but the God who is mystery. And so that he states that doubt is not about correct beliefs, but that faith after doubt is about revolutionary love. And I'll come back to that in a minute. In his book, he describes doubt in a lot of different ways. Doubt is loss. right? We've all had that experience of, here's something I believe in, and I don't hold it anymore, and I feel the loss of that belief. He describes doubt as loneliness. When I have that loss, when I don't have that belief, am I isolated from the other people who hold that belief? Doubt can be a crisis. If I can't hold that belief, if I don't belong to this community anymore, is it a crisis, a desperation point for me? But he also points to doubt as a doorway, as an opening, a place of growth. He points to doubt as being a place of descent, of going down into our deepest being, and often a place of dissent, where we have to take a stand that might be contrary to what others believe. So I want to talk about these 4 stages of belief that McLaren talks about. He talks about simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony. Now, I have a handout, not surprisingly. So many of you would be familiar with different stage theorists, Erikson and Maslow and many others. And so he is taking our belief, our individual belief systems, and in fact, the belief that our church organizations have, and dividing them up and looking at them. And what he's positing in this book, in this work, I'll wait till everyone gets a copy of the paper. The model suggests that faith develops through questioning and doubt, that we move from a dualistic us versus them view in simplicity to navigating multiple perspectives and complexity, questioning beliefs in perplexity, and ultimately finding a deeper sense of love and connection in harmony. These stages represent a progression where individuals move from this black and white dualistic view to acknowledging the complexities of our faith, the contradictions they perceive, and eventually arriving at a mature and integrated understanding. It's not a rigid model, but more like a cyclical one, where individuals go back and forth from one stage to the next. McLaren aligns these stages with the 2 halves of life. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work from Carl Jung, Thomas Merton, and Richard Rohr, that we have 2 halves of our life. And in the first half of our life, we are building the container, the structures of our personality necessary to exist in the world. That's the first half of our life. The second is where we fill that container with meaning. There usually is a crisis point or an inflection point between the 2. And it can happen when we're in our 20s. It can happen when we're in our 70s. It's not necessarily a chronological perspective. We typically have some life experience that moves us from simply the ego stage of kind of, how do I build the structures? How do I build the things that are part of my life? And how do I find meaning in it? So he aligns these first 2 stages, simplicity and complexity, with the first half of life. The third one, perplexity, he aligns as this kind of transition period. And the fourth, the second half of life. So I'd like to go through them with you, at least in a short detail, to kind of talk about how do we understand this? How do we understand this as individuals in terms of the doubts and questions we have? And how do we understand it in church communities as well? So the first stage is simplicity, our early growth as individuals. It's a stage of dualistic thinking, where things are viewed as right or wrong, good or bad, and there's a focus on pleasing authority and being part of the in-group. The focus is a black and white view with clear answers to every question, with an emphasis on us versus them. Our motive is pleasing authority figures and being considered right or an insider. And the perception is dualistic. Everything is either good or bad, right or wrong. We can all probably relate to the early stages in our life, right? When it was about the simplistic understanding of God, this dualistic understanding of God, and us versus them, Christians versus Muslims versus Jews versus Buddhists, or Catholics versus Episcopalians versus other Protestants. I'm either black or white, right or wrong, in or out. And that sustains us for a good portion of our lives. And it often reflects the way that our church communities look and appear. If we look around our country today, we see that, right? It's us versus them. It's this way or the highway. McLaren says this is not a good place to be. It's a necessary place for us to start, but it's not the place where we want to end up. He then suggests that we go on to a stage called complexity. And I'm using his terms, not mine. In this stage, individuals begin to see there is more than one way to do things and more than one way to interpret beliefs. This can involve challenging established norms and seeking more personal freedom. The focus is adjusting to the more complex realities of our life, which often occurs during adolescence. The motives are achieving our goals, being seen as successful and independent. Perception is a dawning awareness of the limitations and nuances that previously held those simple beliefs. This is adolescence. It could be chronological adolescence, or it could be the adolescence of middle age, which some of us continue to go through. I know I'm still in my adolescence. I may not look like it, but I still feel like it. But this place of where we've moved beyond the black and the white, the in or the out, and realize that there are goals to achieve in our life. There are coaches and mentors who can help us move along. That the simple beliefs that held us, that were part of our story, there's a bigger picture. He talks about it in terms of his view of sexuality and rock and roll. He talks about how, as an adolescent, he was confronted with these realities that who he was becoming did not match up with how he was told he had to be. That's an inflection point for many of us, right? When the ways we were told this is how you have to be, we see a bigger picture, we see a bigger world. And so a break occurs, and to move even beyond the second stage to perplexity. This is probably where many of us find ourselves in this day and age. It's a stage characterized by doubt, confusion, and the questioning of one's entire belief system. It involves acknowledging the complexity of beliefs and not having easy answers. The focus is on realizing the shortcoming, contradictions, or moral failings within a religion, often due to scandal or conflict with known facts. Our motive at this point is seeking honesty, authenticity, and truth. The perception is a state of crisis and questioning, where individuals may feel pushed out of their faith community by those who feel threatened by their doubts. As a spiritual director, as a retreat director, I get to spend a lot of time with people who come in questioning, who come in perplexed, right? The ways in which they were brought up in their church, no longer serve them. The church or the civic organization or the political entity, it can be any of these things, no longer serves them. Often there's a breakdown, scandal. My goodness, in the Catholic Church have we known scandal? I know not other churches have it, but certainly Catholics have it. We see people's clay feet. And so all of a sudden, this authority that I've placed my trust in, or this coach or mentor or whoever it is, I no longer trust. And when trust breaks down, doubt enters in. And when we feel uncomfortable, as I think often we do in our religious traditions, to express that doubt, we feel pushed out. We feel unwelcome. The pews are emptier, right? We know that. The pews are emptier today. Our engagement in civil society is far weaker today. And to a large extent, it's because we are in this midst of this perplexity, where what we held, what we believed in, no longer holds true. But Brian holds to a way forward. He holds to a path of humility and harmony. Harmony is this final stage where the focus shifts from correct beliefs to a deeper understanding of revolutionary love. And I'll come back to that. It involves seeking unity in the essentials and a sense of connection and a contribution to the greater whole. The focus, I read the other ones wrong. The focus is realizing the shortcomings and contradictions. I copied this wrong. It is an understanding that the way we thought things should be are not the way they are. And so how do we find a new place? How do we find where belief should be? So McLaren talks about this not being a ladder, but a cyclical cycle. Sorry, let me just get my pages in order. And we can, at different points in time, be in different stages based on different topics. He calls doubt the catalyst. Catalyst, right, is in a chemical equation. Catalyst in a chemical experiment is what brings about change. And when we look at Brian McLaren's work, when we look at Rachel Held Evans' work, when we look at Dorothy Bass, when we look at a lot of theologians today, they're saying we need a catalyst, we need this new model. That the models that we've held and had don't work. And so doubt shouldn't be something we fear. Doubt should be something we embrace. Because this doubt helps us move along this journey. It helps us move from one stage to the next. He holds and fully believes that we are beyond the stage of correct beliefs. Yes, we will continue to recite the Nicene Creed on Sundays. But he holds that we need something more. He quotes in this book another theologian who had a difficult time, Rob Bell, who you may be familiar with. And they're walking along the beach by Brian's home. And Rob shares this. It's strange, but to the degree I stare into the abyss and accept the inevitability that I will someday die, and the possibility that humanity will eventually go extinct, and our little human DNA story will be over forever. To the degree I face this without trying to suppress it, candy coat it with some beliefs, or fix it with some dogma, something happens. I stop trying to explain away all the pain of the universe in my life. I stop having some ironclad explanation for everything, and I admit that I don't know. I feel less and less like I'm trying to play God and have all the answers, and I feel more and more that the tiny human being that I actually am. The more I face this stunning fragility of life and the tiny scope of what I can actually figure out, the more I find myself looking around and thinking, wow, I'm still alive now. And that strikes me as a pretty wonderful thing, a gift, a wonder, a miracle even. It's like waking up after a catastrophe and realizing you lost everything, but you're still alive. And then when you realize when you had everything, you didn't even feel half this alive. So, I'm not addressing particular doubts. I'm not addressing one's doubt in Scripture, in the inerrancy of the Bible, in our theological perspectives. What I am saying is we're on a journey together. Because I can have my doubts, and I certainly do, about some things that my church tradition says, and I'm sure that some of you have doubts about things that your church tradition says. I have doubts about the country that I live in. Some of you probably have those doubts as well. We heard a little bit out in TJ's homily today. But if we look at our doubts exclusively from an individual perspective, and we don't find the place like this forum to have honest conversation about them, then we wander off. We're no longer in the pews. We no longer vote. We no longer engage in civic conversations. Barbara Brown Taylor wrote this in An Altar in a World. In an age of information overload, the last thing any of us needs is more information about God. We need the practice of the incarnation, by which God saves the lives of those whose intellectual scent has turned them dry as dust, who have run frighteningly low on the bread of life, who are dying to know more God in their bodies. Not more about God, more God. So, what does this mean for us? Being an Ignatian, being Jesuit trained, I draw upon the wisdom of Pope Francis in one of his first encyclicals, The Joy of the Gospel, when he talks about the church. I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. More than by fear of going astray, my hope is that we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up within the structures which give us a false sense of security, within rules which make us harsh judges, within habits that make us feel safe. While at our door, people are starving, and Jesus does not tire of saying to us, "Give them something to eat." So, I have my own doubts. I have my doubts about some statements in the Nicene Creed. I have some doubts about what the Eucharist really is. I have some doubts about lots of aspects of the church community that I've grown up in, I'm part of, and I've worked for my entire life. But what calls me back is this belief in the action of the gospel. I don't know that we'll ever know all the things in the Nicene Creed until we get to heaven. I don't know that we'll know everything we need to know about our faith. I don't know that we'll fully understand what the resurrection means. But I believe in the person of Jesus. And that's who I follow. And that's whose creed of love I feel called to follow, even when I can't assent to the other things. I can find in Jesus a person who my life resonates with and whose life resonates with me. And so, despite all the doubts that I think any of us might find, if we can look and find in Jesus that person, then we'll be okay. It will all work out in the end. And no, we won't feed everyone in our lives, and we won't have political solutions to every problem that we deal with. But we begin to work day by day in a community of love, as people of love, then we'll make great strides. I have a final handout for you that I'll give to you as we kind of conclude, and it's called the Creed of Love. It's very different than the Nicene Creed because it talks about the actions and the person of Jesus. It draws on the scripture and the way he lived his life. That for me is the creed that I want to believe in. And when I wake up in the morning, as Rachel Evans did, and have my doubts. When Rob Bell doubts the meaning of life. When Brian McLaren tries to explain this faith journey that we're on. I'll hold to Jesus, and I hope you will too. So, I think we have a few moments for questions, for responses, for retorts. So the question was, what is, explain this as not being a ladder, this process of moving through these 4 stages, but being more cyclical is one aspect. And then the other is, how do we bring the best of what we have along and leave behind? Is that what, so that's kind of a summary. So I'll bring in another Jesuit here, Teilhard de Chardin, whose idea of human evolution, he was a paleontologist, a scientist who studied evolution, and who was also one of the great theologians of the last century. But he had this idea that we're in a spiral, right? And the spiral is God is the starting point and God is the end point. Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega. And that we circle around, but we're moving forward. So we circle around, we experience things again in our life, but we're constantly moving forward. So that's the overlay that I would apply to McLaren's work, is that we constantly are going back. We see the things that we saw in the earlier stages of our life, those beliefs that we had, but we see them through different lenses as we move forward. We see them as we've grown, and we've grown from simplicity and this dualistic belief system that we've had to hold on to the best of them as we move forward. But it's not a straight progression, because we will go back and forth. We will go back and forth. So it is, and that's a great way to put it. So how do we take a new lens to look on the earlier stages of our life? How do we kind of take the best of what we've come to understand in terms of scriptural? So again, in the last century, studies of scripture, studies of liturgy, all these things were going back, and they were looking back at the early centuries of the church and applying the historical criticism and all those kinds of things. So that's the question: is how do we take the best of who we are as individuals, and how do we look back? It's going to be different for each one of us. And it's going to certainly be different. Brian McLaren would say, and he has an interplay with someone in the book about there's not many stage 4 churches out there. Quite honestly, there's not many stage 3 churches out there. Most churches are stage 1 and stage 2. We know that, right? Even a wonderful place like St. Paul's, right? Probably you're getting into stage 3, certainly. But how do we look back, and it is unique for each of us. How have we grown through the story of our life? Doubt for many people is fearful, right? It is that sense of loss. It is that sense of loneliness, right? Particularly when we're in that stage 1 place where, I've lost this belief that I've had. And as a result, I'm lonely because I'm not in the community that we've had. But when we turn that story around and say, oh, this is part of my story, but it's not the whole story. And when we look and say, it's also a doorway, right? Maybe this belief that served me when I was 7 doesn't serve me when I'm 35 or 55. And so we learn to say, we learn that the questions are the important thing, that the doubt is, as Brian McLaren says, the doubt is the catalyst for movement forward, right? None of us wants to stay in the place where we were as 7-year-olds. We want to move forward in our life, and that means letting some things go to envision something better. Thank you and the appreciative inquiry is a great way to think about that. Perfect. That section of the creed, right? God from God, light from light, true God from, that is metaphorical, which is the fourth place. I've got the Catholic version of the Nicene Creed. Some of you may know that in 2011 we redid the creed, and so we got some more concrete language, and we got consubstantial with the Father instead of one being with the Father. And so, but there is that metaphorical, but that's where when we're in that 4th stage, when we're in that 3rd stage, we can look back and say, oh, this is not simply about kind of defining strict parameters of doctrine, but it's about opening us up to who the person of Jesus is. What's the relationship of the Trinity? How we would read that, right, in the 4 stages of our life, how someone in the 1st stage would read this, is very concrete, very real, very narrow. Then someone in that 2nd stage who's beginning to question and be open to different perspectives. And then the 3rd stage, the real question of perplexity and trying to say, what does this mean? But then to come back again as a 4th stage person and say, oh, there's poetry in here. There's something I can believe in without being so concrete and so narrow. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Many of us spend our lives, and our work lives and our family lives as in stage 1, where it is that kind of, it's us versus them. It's in or out. And I'm not gonna go into appreciative inquiry because that's gonna call me to be a place where I may not feel comfortable with. I think I had an Escher print in my college dorm room, But you're exactly right. It is this kind of, it is in our faith life. Are we willing to question? Are we willing to grow and experience those doubts as catalyst towards movement? And do we see the things that kind of, again, take us back to where we were, but with new eyes, new vision? That, I think, is very important. Important. Thank you for sharing that. To see that God is mystery and metaphor beyond our simplistic understandings of God is where we find that awe and fear and trembling. And it can be a scary place, but it can also be a beautiful, wonderful place as well. And again, this creed of love is something I hold on to. It's the person and the life of Jesus is the way for me.
Thank you, Bill, so much for being with us today. Thank you.